Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this first in a series of Pop Conversations run by PopCon. An absolute pleasure to be joined by Suella Braverman, the Tory MP for Fareham, and of course, formerly our Home Secretary and Attorney General, and an outspoken and brilliant campaigning Conservative on a whole range of issues. Barely a day or two goes by without you stealing the headlines on something that I usually fundamentally agree with you on, Suella. So welcome. It's absolutely great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. Very pleased to be with you today.
Suella, I want to start with asylum policy and particularly Rwanda. That's the topic that is going through Parliament at the moment. And we've heard from the Prime Minister today that he's determined to get flights off the ground within 10 or 12 weeks. I think it initially said it was going to be the spring. 12 weeks' time will be July, which is quite a liberal interpretation of spring, I think. The Labour opposition and the House of Lords are batting it back. So we're into this constitutional ping pong, as it's called. But you, from the Conservative side, have voiced quite a lot of concerns. Now, let me, if you like, try and put what I understand the Prime Minister's case to be, which is that there were a number of sort of legal and administrative hurdles. He blames the Labour Party for holding up progress here. But if we could get flights in the air to Rwanda, we wouldn't necessarily move vast numbers of people, but the mere fact of it happening would act as a deterrent and a kind of pour encourager les autres. And that would then start to tackle the number of illegal people coming into the country. Why aren't you convinced?
Well, I think you're right. That is the Prime Minister's case. I disagree with him on the way he's chosen to deliver his objective. The fundamental problem that we've got when it comes to illegal migration is the legal framework of human rights laws and international laws combined with the Human Rights Act and our very activist judicial review climate. Now, the combination of those factors makes the legal environment very claimant friendly. When I use the word claimant, I mean asylum seeker or illegal arrival or migrant. And we have a really broad plethora of rights and claims and appeal rights and options for claimants. We have a very claimant friendly environment. I used to work before I was an MP, I used to work as a barrister defending the Home Office on immigration and asylum cases. And that's really where my eyes were first opened to the very active marketplace, really, for claimants when it came to challenging the decision to deport, the decision to detain, the decision to refuse someone leave to remain. On every decision that the government makes when it comes to immigration and asylum, there will be many rights of appeal and then appeal rights following those. So someone can be in the system, I would say, cynically, some would say, gaming the system for years, often at the cost of the British taxpayer, because it's often legally aided. And so that is really the environment within which we're working. This is our third Act of Parliament. If it gets royal assent this week, it'll be our third Act of Parliament. And unfortunately, we've failed on every attempt because we haven't, and this is the crux of my answer, we haven't, through our own domestic legislation, excluded sufficiently the availability of those claims, appeal rights, and avenues of challenge available to the claimant. That's why I believe the bill under consideration right now is still fatally flawed. It doesn't go far enough. It still leaves far too many loopholes, far too many gaps, which will be exploited by the claimant lawyers. They will, so how this will play out is that, and I've seen it as a barrister in private practice representing the Home Secretary in the early 2010s, as Attorney General, supporting Boris and Priti to try and get the flights off, and then as Home Secretary trying to work with Rishi to do it. I've seen it in many guises. What will happen is once we get royal assent and we operationalise it, and there'll be a few weeks or months to do that, we will take a decision to detain some individuals, they will challenge that decision to detain. That will then add weeks or months onto the process. If they're unsuccessful, we will then want to remove them. They'll challenge the decision to remove them. Again, that will add weeks or months. And just as we saw in June 2021, now it is, isn't it? I think the flight was on the tarmac, and we wanted to get the flight off, and it was thwarted. It was thwarted at the last minute by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, by an unknown judge, through an opaque process. The UK government didn't even have an opportunity to make representations in that judicial hearing, and it's taken us until the end of 2023 to get to the Supreme Court. So that's an estimate of the kind of time frame that we're looking at.
Can I dig into this a bit then? Because, you're a distinguished lawyer, but for failed lawyers like myself or laymen, what I'm trying to get my head around is that you can appeal too often, or that you can appeal on flimsy grounds. I mean, we obviously get kind of the core celeb cases, the horrific case of the acid attacker who apparently converted to Christianity. So, give me some examples of the sort of claims that are made that you think are either preposterous or time-wasting or gaming the system. Is it a change of religion? Because presumably you do want a system in place where due consideration is given to whether this person's life is in danger if we send them home or refuse their application. But what are the sort of things that get your blood running in that process?
Well, of course, I must say, I do believe in some right to challenge executive decision making. That's an absolute essential in our justice system and our democracy. But the complaint I have is that those rights have been expanded to a point which is disproportionate and unreasonable, such that it's to totally undermine the government's ability to control its borders. Examples, well, if we look at the June 2021 flight and the people who were taken off, they also often, there were about 30 passengers on that original flight. And as you saw, it was whittled down to 0 in the end. The kinds of claims that they were bringing related to Article 3 rights. So Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights is the right against torture and degrading and inhumane treatment. Now, I don't have a problem with that. I want to protect people from torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. The problem is it's become so stretched such that people can say that they wouldn't get the right healthcare facilities in Rwanda, and they've got a particular condition. Often they will claim to have a mental health problem that will often be backed up by a doctor's note, and they will say, "Well, I've got a mental health problem, and I've got suicidal tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
And if you send me to Rwanda, there will be insufficient healthcare provision there, and my mental health will be untreated, and that's a violation of my Article 3 rights." That's one example. But outside the context, that narrow context of the plane going to Rwanda, what we see is religion. So we do see the Mohammed Azidi case, which is now sadly infamous. People will claim refugee convention rights. So they will say, "Well, I'm a Christian. Doesn't matter that I've come from a Muslim country and that I might have been raised as a Muslim as in my childhood. I am now a Christian. I'm here in the UK. I've been going to church, and I've got a priest who vouches for me, and he says that I'm a God-fearing, church-going Christian. And if you send me back to my Islamic country like Afghanistan or Iran or some other Middle Eastern country, I'm going to be persecuted because I'm a Christian."
But that might be true, right?
Well, the reality is, as we've seen, I'm afraid, and we've had several priests come out and blow the whistle, they're not Christians. So they are abusing the generosity of the Christian church. They are undermining the integrity of the Church of England, and they're exploiting the legal system to their advantage. And it's a very easy way to get asylum.
So tell me then, how would the idea? I understand you're not going to vote against the government on the vote tonight, but you're going to abstain, as I understand it.
Yes.
What would be the difference between the ideal Suella approach to this and the present Sunak approach to this? What would you do differently if you were in charge of this bill? I mean, or what groundwork would you have to lay before attempting to pass this bill?
Well, I mean, my position now is actually, I actually believe we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, because I think that is the cleanest, most intellectually honest and coherent position to hold. I do believe we've got a foreign court in Strasbourg, which is stymieing our ability to control our borders. It is not just, incidentally, in the field of immigration and asylum. It's in policing law, it's in sentencing, it's in welfare, it's in housing, it's in environmental law, it's in all sorts of policy areas. The ECHR crops up as a big obstacle for ministers. So I would actually leave the ECHR now. I don't think we should put it in a manifesto. I don't think we should have a referendum. I think we've had enough of those. I think we've tried now 3 times. I believe the ECHR and the court will be another obstacle that we face. I think we have to come out of the ECHR. We do that by invoking Article 58 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It gives 6 months' notice to the Council of Europe. I think we have to pass a tightly drafted piece of legislation which takes us out of the ECHR, which repeals the Human Rights Act, which is a domestic piece of legislation which incorporates the ECHR into British law. And we then legislate for a British Bill of Rights. So I'm not talking about scrapping rights and, a race to the bottom. I believe very much that we've got a rich tradition in the United Kingdom of protecting rights and civil liberties, but I believe it should be English courts, English judges, and English law that is the law of the land, not an international framework, which I'm afraid, despite its noble intentions, it was drafted in the aftermath of World War II, and I don't disagree with any of the text of the convention. The court has now become politicized, interventionist, and obstructive to the nation state's ability to control its borders. And so that's why I believe withdrawal is actually the right thing to do, and we need to do it now.
That's fascinating, and I mean that actually provides a good basis for. I think we'll poll the audience. We've got nearly 200 people here already on. How much do you agree or disagree with Suella on the statement the UK should leave the ECHR? We'll put a poll up on that and tell you the results in a couple of minutes. But what I'm intrigued by, Suella, is I should say I think it's only Suella and I who can't vote on this poll, but I would be voting, I think, the same way that Suella would be voting. So let me just click the poll off while the rest of you vote on it. Leaving ECHR is not enough, right? And this reminds me a bit of the whole Brexit conundrum. Let's leave the European Union to take back control. But if the taking back control was to take it from Brussels bureaucrats and hand it to Whitehall bureaucrats, we're no better off. If we only left the ECHR, it wouldn't really be worth the candle, am I right? We would still have the problem with the Domestic Human Rights Act and our own legal system mitigating against. So it wouldn't be going all the way to Strasbourg, but it would be stopped by the British Supreme Court.
So we'd have to repeal the Human Rights Act. We'd have to have a domestic Bill of Rights which set out rights and responsibilities. I think we have a culture which is far too heavily weighted in favour of rights and entitlements and, what can the state owe me, rather than actually talking about what each citizen can contribute to the state and how, what are the minimum expectations of being a good citizen contributing to a positive and happy society. I would like to see something that talked about rights and responsibilities, but also drafted them in a way that struck the right balance. So, of course, preventing torture, protecting free speech, protecting the freedom of religion, protecting the right of life. I would expect all of those things to be in our British Bill of Rights as a bare minimum. But I think we'd have to legislate and make it clear that they would have to be balanced properly against the need for public safety. So, for example, one of the problems we have in immigration, or I saw it firsthand as Home Secretary, is we struggle to deport foreign criminals from this country, people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes, rapists, murderers, drug dealers, paedophiles, and they might have served some custody in the UK. We then want to deport them, and they use human rights they use human rights to prevent their deportation. They'll say they've got they've got a baby here, or they've got a relative here, so they claim Article 8 rights. I don't think the British people signed up to allow foreign paedophiles to stay in this country because of their human rights. And so that would be an example of where I'd want the legislation to make clear that public safety and the national security and the national interest would have to weigh heavily when it came to balancing these rights.
So this is fascinating. Can you explain to me why, after, because you've laid out what the Suella sort of legislative programme would be here. We've only got, what, perhaps 3 months, perhaps 6 or 7 months to a general election. How the hell have the Tories been in power for 14 years? And we haven't made any progress here. And the Rwanda bill feels like a bit of a Hail Mary, right? This is not the first act of a Conservative government that's then learning from it, in the early days of office and trying something else. Why hasn't this been attempted yet? Because if we were to institute your suggested programme, sounds fine and dandy. I should just say I appreciate this is a self-selecting audience, but 84% strongly agree with you. We should leave the ECHR. 11% agree, 2% don't know, and 5% disagree. As I say, it is a self-selecting audience, obviously, but nevertheless, this audience agrees with you a lot. Why? Obviously, if you started now, you wouldn't have time to do that before the general election. Why has it come to this sorry pass that we haven't grasped this nettle earlier?
Well, I do actually disagree with you there, Mark. I do think it is still possible in the narrow window of time that we have left. If we have an autumn election or winter election, we still have 6 months. We are, we're the 22nd of April. Prime Minister could literally send a letter to the Council of Europe tomorrow. That's an executive prerogative. And then we could start the legislative process. That would give us a 6-month period. That would take us to October, and we could have this situation tied up. Why haven't we done it over the last decade? I think there's been a real failure to grasp the enormity of the problems left by what I call the long tail of Blairism. And, I think they've been, the problems have come to the fore in recent years in the context of illegal migration in some of the ways I set out. And I think prior to that, I think we haven't really seen the root cause of the problem. And I think only through the problems occurring and being presented to us have we been able to see what the solutions might be. But I think there has been a cultural, political and institutional resistance to really grasp the nettle and deal with some of the Blairite legacies, whether it's the Human Rights Act or whether it's the Equality Act. There are many issues that we just haven't really got to the bottom of.
Well, I mean, you're speaking straight to the PopCon script here, right? I mean, our analysis is that for those who are disappointed with progress over the past 14 years, not to say that nothing's been achieved, but that perhaps after 14 years of Conservative government, one might have expected more to be achieved, that the problem was that we sort of accepted the Blairite institutional infrastructure and consensus from the start, thinking we could work with the grain, and it's taken a hell of a long time to work out that you can't really work with that grain. You're going to have to actually transform the institutional and legal structure of the United Kingdom to give conservatism more of a fighting chance. Do you basically agree with that proposition?
Totally. I mean, if you look at Brexit was some call it a revolution, I call it a restoration. And there's still some way to go before we really see some of the big benefits of restoration, but it's a restoration of sovereignty, a restoration of autonomy. But that was a big thing. The establishment, Whitehall, the government's official line was to remain in the EU. I was a new MP at the time of the referendum. I remember having the conversation with David Cameron. I hadn't even been in Parliament a year, and I had to tell him that I was not going to support him and I was going to be voting to leave. And I remember what he said to me. He said, "Well, Suella, you've got to follow your heart in politics." I said, my heart says I need to leave. I need to vote to leave the European Union. I believe our United Kingdom for centuries has been a beacon of self-government, democracy. We've brought so much to the world, actually, through the British parliamentary system. And I believe this is the next chapter of self-government. It's the next chapter of writing our destiny. And we've done so many, the United Kingdom has, achieved great feats of democratic, constitutional reform in the past. We can surely do this. And there's a huge prize to gain. And, freedom, it's very hard to resist the call for freedom. And Brexit was about freedom. And
well, it seemed pretty hard to get the call listened to, right? I kind of assumed when the referendum was won, job done. Myself and a whole load of others were caught slightly by surprise that there then needed to be, what was it, a 4.5-year battle to actually get it over the line.
Yeah, and that's my point. So Brexit was such a long and painful battle. Many of the divisions are still not healed. And so can you imagine having some of these other radical reforms happening alongside? I don't know, maybe it would have been good for us to do all of it, like leave the ECHR and repeal the HRA and the Equality Act, and do it all at the same time. I don't know. Brexit was such a tumultuous time for the administration, for the establishment, for the civil service, for the government, for the country, that that in itself feels that it was a big deal. And so we've taken one enormous step, and we're moving out. We're extricating ourselves slowly from the orbit of the EU. I do think now we're on this path. We've got to keep going, and step by step, we will actually fully restore sovereignty.
I want to touch briefly on immigration. And sometimes I get a little frustrated that immigration and asylum are just sort of bandied together, and we're just sort of measuring net population inflows and outflows. They're very different things. And of course, immigration in terms of sheer number of human beings is a much bigger number than asylum. I mean, I think of am I roughly right on the numbers? Last year, we were net 750,000 up in population in rough terms, but I think it was below 10% of that was asylum cases, and 90% of it was immigration cases. So let's put aside those who say, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, that they're fleeing persecution and would face, barbarism if they're sent home. Let's now deal with people who say, look, I want to move to the UK. I want to be a student here, or I want to be a brain surgeon here, or I want to be a fruit picker here, or I want to, live with my uncle and run a restaurant here. How are we getting that wrong, do you think? Because it's the numbers, firstly, are we getting it wrong? I mean, do you think the numbers are too high? And what would be an acceptable number? Can we even think in those terms? Do you think we can work out from some sort of central planning approach that, 100,000 is okay, but 150,000 is too much? Or have we got the basic rules and protocols and the basis and the criteria on which we would let people in wrong? And that's the problem, i.e. the type of person coming, whether they're, for example, net beneficiaries of the British tax system rather than net contributors would be one way you might measure it, for example, or whether they have, even if they're earning good money themselves, too many dependents. Because this is the bulk of it, if indeed you are worried that immigration is too high.
So the short answer to your questions there is yes, I think the number is too high. Yes, I think we owe it to the British people who have voted time and time again for lower numbers some level of transparency and accountability. And by that, I mean setting out at the beginning of every year our quota, for want of a better word, but a system of what our labour market needs. Because I do support some level of inward migration. There are aspects of the labour market and the economy that do need it. But I think we've gone, off the reservation when it comes to the numbers right now. So I think, there needs to be, and if you look at Australia, actually, that's how they do and operate their points-based system. Every year, the government of Australia assesses the labour market and says, well, we've assessed, the construction sector, and it's just impossible to recruit domestically, but we're going to need 3,000 construction workers. We're going to need 5,000 nurses after exhausting all avenues. And they set it out. And then at the end of the year, they will assess how those numbers have actually played out, and then they set a new kind of quota and limit, and that's how they can really be held to account. Here, the problem is, no one can really see what's happening until it's too late, and all you've got is politicians' promises and pledges, and unfortunately, we've really failed. We failed. I voted, going back to Brexit, I voted to leave the European Union. Primarily to lower migration. as well as freedom and sovereignty. The numbers then in 2016 were far too high. At the 2019 general election, the level of net migration stood at 245,000. Our manifesto pledged to lower the overall numbers.
And it's trebled.
Exactly. As of the most recent figures, November 2023, that figure's gone up to 750,000.
I wonder whether there might be a slightly more market-orientated approach here. Obviously, with my Institute of Economic Affairs antecedents, I'm always looking for the price mechanism to do the heavy lifting, rather than a central bureaucracy trying to work out exactly how many fruit pickers, construction workers, or brain surgeons we need. Couldn't we say something that I'm going to oversimplify here, but to try and make my point, that if you were to look at government expenditure in the UK, it's about £14,000 per annum per person. And my sort of rudimentary starting point would be, if you're contributing more than that, come in. If you're contributing less than that, we've got a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
But if if a couple want to come in and their taxes are more than £14,000 per head, or somebody wants to come in with a dependent and their taxes are at least 28,000, that seems to me almost I want to price it, because I don't know how we would work out exactly how many construction workers, fruit pickers, Premier League footballers, or pop stars, or whatever else it might be we would need, isn't it? Couldn't the price mechanism do better of the heavy lifting here?
I think there's some value to that proposition. I mean, I think it is possible to assess the gaps in the labour market. We already have a form of the shortage occupation list. I would actually scrap that list, because I think, again, it's become inflated, bloated, and meaningless. When I went through it as Home Secretary, I was shocked to find that the shortage occupation list included librarians, florists, and careers advisors. And I thought, this is becoming a bit of a joke. This is just a wish list for any lobbyist, basically, that's got a hold of a Whitehall official. But I think that you could assess gaps in the labour market, and I think you could look at what price you're attaching to attach a value to various employees and workers who are coming into the country. What we have now, I think, is the worst of both worlds, if I'm honest. We have an unprecedented and unsustainable level, so just in terms of pure numbers of people coming into this country, and the vast majority are low wage earners. So they are, and we, they will bring dependents as well. So the costs, traditionally the OBR has sought to ignore the costs of low wage, low skilled migration. I think that's one of the reasons why we've gone so wrong, that the OBR has generally worked on the premise that more numbers into the country, regardless of their wage, regardless of their skills, is automatically going to be a good thing for the economy. I reject that wholly. It doesn't take into account GDP per capita, which is sluggish, to say the least. It doesn't take into account the costs. So if you're getting a large number of low-skilled, low-wage migrants, you will find that over the course of their time in this country, they will be net beneficiaries from the British economy rather than net contributors, after you take into account schooling, health services, and housing.
And welfare, right? And welfare.
And welfare, exactly. And so that has been totally overlooked in our debate on the levels of legal migration. And I do place large parts of the blame at the OBR for that, because ministers have worked on the basis that the OBR carries a lot of authority, but as we've seen time and time again, their forecasts are wrong. And I'm afraid the way they actually calculate the value of migration has been totally flawed for me.
Well, Suella, you might be right that this was an inherited part of the Blair consensus, right? That the kind of absolute accepted norm was immigration good for the economy, and sort of anyone who says that higher immigration is in any way bad for the economy is a fruitcake or a racist. That seems to be challenged somewhat now. I mean, that still seems to be the claim made by some of your political opponents, but not universal. Listen, I want to move on because I'm conscious we're on the clock, but I'm going to put another poll up. Do you agree with Suella that net migration into the UK is too high and is unsustainable? Those weren't quite the words that Suella used, but that's the poll we're going to put up. And again, you can vote strongly agree, and we'll get the results to you in a couple of minutes' time. We've done a lot on asylum.
Mark, can I just say very quickly, just to wrap up the issue? I mean, what I would say, and again, this is kind of where I think the government can go further, is we need to actually have a cap. We need to say, well, first of all, we need to raise the salary threshold. We need to limit the number of dependents that people can bring in. We need to ensure that we need to focus more on high-skilled, high-wage migrants coming into the economy, because they are going to be net contributors, going to your previous point. And last, I think we need a cap. So we need to actually set out a number. The government seems to be very scared of committing itself to a number. I think if the government has the privilege of serving and has made a promise to the people to lower migration, and they've, as I said, they've voted for it time and time again, they need to be held to account. And that's the only way to do that, is to say there is a limit and there is a cap.
Well, blimey, it's even more decisive than the last one. 85% strongly agree and 12% agree. So again, on this slightly self-selecting audience of around 200, we've got huge support there. I want to move on to some other issues that you've been at the forefront of, Suella, as well. And I suppose I want to block all these together in terms of freedom of speech, freedom to protest, and policing. Quite a bit to get through. We'll try and do it in a few minutes. First thing to say is, tell us a little bit about the National Conservative Conference that you attended in Brussels, whereas if I understand it, the Brussels mayor then at least attempted to close this down via the local police. I mean, a total Streisand effect, in that the amount of publicity the conference got as a consequence went up by a factor of several hundred, I would say. But you were speaking there, I believe. I think you just about got in. But what was going on? And I appreciate we're talking about a different jurisdiction and a foreign country, but this seems to be a more and more common trait in Western politics now, no?
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a hairy moment, Mark. I'd battled my way through armed police to get into the venue this time last week on the Tuesday. And as I was taking to the stage and giving my speech, I saw them advance to the back of the room. And I really did think that I might get arrested and spend the night in a cell. But they desisted. They didn't arrest anybody. They actually held back and allowed the conference to carry on unimpeded, relatively speaking. And we actually ended up having the full schedule take place in the end. But you're right, it was it really did backfire. The overreach and the hysterical reaction didn't really have the desired effect that the mayor of Brussels wanted, I think. Are we seeing this as a trend? What I'm really concerned about is this, the throwing the label far right around, Nazi, fascist, it's been thrown around every time a conservative speaker seeks to talk about issues like migration. You alluded to it before. If you speak or argue in favour of controlled borders or lower migration, you can guarantee pretty much being accused of racism or something worse. Brexit, I'm afraid we saw the kind of uglier side of political debate during that referendum, when many of us who voted to leave the European were again accused of being far right and racist and bigoted and Nazis, wanting to stop the boats. You might remember when I introduced our legislation last year, a famous former footballer compared the government and myself to 1930s Germany. And I think this has just been, it's been used so much that it's actually debased and diminish the effect that it's had. So,
but that's, if you like, a kind of cultural thing. That's our opponents being hysterical, and you would kind of hope they would be called out. Are you worried that there are now sort of legal impediments in terms of free speech as well? Things like non-hate crime incidents and this sort of stuff. The police coming around and knocking on your door because you've said something on Twitter that has offended the trans community, for sake of argument. In universities, which, there's sort of quasi-public-private institutions in which people are deplatformed. These are supposed to be centres of learning in which all sorts of views are supposed to be put forward. Back in the early 90s, when I was at university, I was delighted to hear from conservatives, Marxists, anarchists, liberals, the whole plethora. It now seems to be much more monochrome. So culturally, I agree with you that there's that screaming people, particularly from the left to the right. But even legally, it seems to be we're swerving into some pretty hot waters, aren't we?
I do think there is a tendency to do that, and particularly against right wing politicians. I think that the incident last week in Brussels reflects that. I think, as you say, there's been a hypersensitivity to debating some of the legitimate issues when it comes to trans rights and gender ideology, or other matters. And freedom of speech is essential to a democracy. I support freedom of speech. I support the right to protest. Those are qualified rights. They are not absolute rights. So there is a limit to those rights. I would take a liberal view of those rights. And when people cross the line into hate speech, into racial abuse, into incitement to violence, then I think you're into the criminal territory. And then I think that
this is the interesting one where I wanted to press you a bit. You're obviously a staunch supporter of the state of Israel. You and I would agree on that. But you've voiced a lot of concerns about the pro-Palestinian protests. I don't know whether you want to call them pro-Palestinian, or anti-Israel, or even anti-Semitic. How do we draw the line here? Because my politics and yours wouldn't be too different on this issue. But I'm queasy about closing down the other side. I would need to feel that there really was, I don't know, threat to life and limb, or incitement was really taking place. I think from the river to the sea of itself, whilst I find it offensive, I probably wouldn't arrest somebody for saying that. How do you draw the line here? Or are we in danger of, those of your and my persuasion trying to cancel people who disagree with us on a particular issue, and vice versa? Is there a kind of tit for tat Dutch auction here? Or do you have in mind why you think some of these Palestinian protests have crossed the line beyond freedom of expression into something nefarious?
When it comes to the Palestinian or pro-Palestinian marches, I do think we're in the sphere of criminality and exceptional circumstances. And I think that's for several reasons. I think we've seen hundreds of thousands of people, so the scale of these marches, hundreds of thousands of people on a weekly basis. And we've seen I think that we've seen unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism. So this is large scale. This is not small scale. Secondly, I think that the kinds of language and references that we've seen are anti-Semitic. So I would disagree with you, Mark, on the on your description of from the river to the sea. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, I believe, is an anti-Semitic chant. It's calling for the eradication of Israel, and therefore the eradication of the Jewish people, because that is their homeland. Calling Israel a genocidal state, an apartheid state, a Nazi state, I believe is anti-Semitic. And I think that there's a real need for many of us to open our eyes to anti-Semitism. It seems that in our country, we're very quick to call out racism against Black people, against Asian people, where it's very obvious. And there's something that slows us down to do so when it comes to Jewish people. I really recommend the book Israelophobia by Jake Wallace-Simmons, who's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and even David Baddiel, Jews Don't Count. It's racism. It's racism, pure and simple. And the fact that it's about, and anti-Semitism has really evolved over many years. It used to be complaints about Jews themselves. That's now morphed into insults about Israel and the homeland for the Jews. I do believe it's just a new version of anti-Semitism. So I think that we need to be very alive to this kind of threatening behavior. And if we've got a situation where it's not safe to cross a street, we have to acknowledge that there's a risk of harm. The police themselves have considered that there's a risk of anti-Semitic violence.
Let me, that helpfully moves me into a question. You've called over the last day or two for Sir Mark Rowley to be fired as the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. He still seems to be under a bit of stress. This is the front page of the Evening Standard, that pressure grows on him. Rishi Sunak seems to have given him some sort of qualified endorsement that he's unhappy with things. But obviously, we've had this Gideon Falter incident, which is pretty gobsmacking. I mean, I think people have slightly misinterpreted it in that some people seem to be, the worry was that the policeman said that Gideon was openly Jewish. That seemed to be a statement of fact. The problem was that he was treated differently because he was openly Jewish, right? He clearly was openly Jewish. One could reasonably make that judgment, but he was then treated differently and appallingly by the police as a consequence of that. Again, it goes to this question about, are our institutions fit for purpose? Do you think it's just a question of getting rid of the head of the Met, or is there something just fundamentally broken about the Met Police?
I think there are serious problems with the Met Police. I mean, it is already in special measures. It has been so for several years. And there's been attempts to turn it around on a broader basis. When it comes to this particular issue, though, I think there has been failure over a protracted period of time. It's been 6 months now. We've seen, the marches, hundreds of thousands of people. We've seen, I would argue, flagrant anti-Semitism on the streets. It's now become normalised. London, all the streets have become no-go zones for Jewish people on the time when these marches take place. It's costing £32 million of Metropolitan police money, 30,000 police shifts, 5,000 rest days have been cancelled to police these marches. So, if you get mugged in London and no police officer turns up, guess what? It's probably because they are being diverted to policing these marches.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the strategy, and this is why I've taken the very regrettable step of calling for Sir Mark to go, because it's gone on for such a long time. There's been speeches, there's been apologies for the apologies, there's been reviews, there's been new laws being introduced. Nothing's changed. There's been a failure of strategy and there's been a failure of tactics. The failure of strategy is that fundamentally what Sir Mark has done is he's treated these marches in the same way as the police generally treat football fans. Yeah. And so what I've said is, right, the bigger group, we're going to cordon off the bigger group and allow the bigger group to do whatever they want to do. And anybody else who comes along, smaller group or individuals, we're just going to wave them on and get them out of the way. I don't think you can apply that strategy to something as emotive and controversial as the Middle Eastern conflict. There are really strongly held views on both sides of the debate. It's about things like religion and race and identity. People are dying in the Middle East. This is a really live and controversial subject. I don't think you can treat people on the streets here as if whether they're Man U supporters or Chelsea supporters.
I would completely agree. I would completely agree with you there.
They've chosen a side. So as a result, the Met have chosen a side. They've chosen to allow the pro-Palestinian marchers to do whatever they want to do, even if it's anti-Semitic, even if it's threatening, even if it's abusive, even if it's criminal. And everybody else just has to get out of the way. I think that's...
No, I mean, I agree with your distinction there as well. As a Southampton FC supporter, I'm usually in the smaller group when it comes to football fans, but I don't consider the policing of it to be racist or unreasonable or unfair. If I was treated differently because of my race or my religion, I would be furious. But I agree that they're treating it a bit like football.
You're a Saints fan, Mark. I think we might need to end the call. Pompey's just been... I
know, we'll be playing you next season. We've got some results from that poll that we put up on the Met Police Commissioner. 53% strongly agree he should be removed, 20% agree, 14% don't know, 15% disagree. So I'm delighted to have a poll that doesn't put sort of 95% of us all on one side of the argument, slightly different views there. I'm now going to take through for our last 12 or 15 minutes just some of the questions that have been the most upvoted. Some of them are about the Conservative Party rather than the issues that we've touched on, but it's philosophy, I think. So Nathan Aquera asks, how can we build support in the Parliamentary Conservative Party for the true blue Conservative policies you stand for and prevent a repeat of when members elected Liz Truss but MPs booted her from office? And I'm going to merge that with a question from Richard Goddard, because he asks, I remain a member of the Conservative Party despite feeling I may have more in common with Reform at present. Can you assure me I'm doing the right thing longer term?
Great questions, because I think that's a real challenge for us going forward. And regardless of the outcome of the election, current polling suggests we're going to be defeated. We will need to really reinforce, rediscover, and relitigate the case for true blue conservatism, as one of your audience put it. And I think we need to. I think there's been a timidity. I think there's been a timidity of on the right to argue for these causes. And I think that partly because of the fears of being rejected by the establishment, called racist or far right, those kinds of things, which do make it challenging. But I think we all have to be bold and brave and speak for truth and freedom and sovereignty. And these are not dirty words. These are noble aspirations that people have voted for time and time again. And I think that we need to be more proactive in advocating for these notions and philosophies within the party. And that's how we'll create a critical mass of MPs, and then a movement within the party that actually does ensure that some of these policies get taken forward. In terms of reform, listen, I agree with the Prime Minister on this. A vote for reform will be a vote for Keir Starmer. And I dread the prospect of Keir Starmer in number 10. I think he would undo Brexit, either explicitly through a second referendum, because we know he campaigned for a second referendum, or implicitly through closer alignment. I think that on migration, he would make no secret of the fact that he would increase migration. A lot of his rhetoric right now is, I want to lower migration because he wants to get elected. But I think track record of Labour governments is that the only way is up when it comes to migration for them. So I don't think he would take any meaningful steps on lowering legal migration. I don't think he would stop the boats. So definitely he wouldn't take us out of the European Convention of Human Rights or do anything with the Human Rights Act. If anything, I think he would make them have aggravating and worse effects on us. I mean, they're talking already about a Race Equality Act, which would be totally superfluous, but actually harmful to the workplace. I think that, Keir Starmer is someone who can't even describe what a woman is, and he'd rather take the knee than stand up for British values. So I'm horrified by the prospect of Keir Starmer, and that's why, we need to stick with the Conservative Party.
And you presumably welcome those who are flirting with or presently voting for reform returning to the Tory fold, right?
Yes, listen, we need more people to vote for Conservative candidates at local and national level at the forthcoming elections.
Should just say our next Pop Conversation coming up next week, May the 1st, that's Wednesday at 6 p.m, the eve of the local elections. That's with David Starkey. Suella, you mentioned earlier that you like describing Brexit as a restoration rather than a revolution. David Starkey's absolutely with you there. He thinks we need a great British restoration of our constitution. So we've put in the chat how you can sign up for the David Starkey Pop Conversation. That's our second one next week. Click on that link and register if you haven't already. Couple of questions now on, let me merge them together, on migration and asylum. Possibly slightly tongue-in-cheek here. Andrew Green says, why not send illegal migrants to a Scottish island, much cheaper than Rwanda? And they'll hate the weather. I don't know whether that's necessarily a reason for doing it. Mark Dunkley asks, why do we still continue to call them asylum seekers when we know full well most are actually economic migrators?
Well, I mean, one of the proposals I've put forward is for overseas territories to be used for our offshoring purposes. I was very much in favour of a temporary transit mechanism to use either something like the Ascension Island or St Helena, or even potentially the Falklands Islands, as a way to get people out of the mainland UK, and off the territory, but still where UK law applies. So we wouldn't have some of these issues around the safety of a third country. And we could either use these places as a temporary staging post and place to accommodate people whilst we sorted out Rwanda, or we could actually try and look for a longer term resolution. So I was very much in favour. It does require massive effort from the military, from the Foreign Office, partnership, really, and unfortunately it wasn't forthcoming. In terms of asylum seekers, well, the reason they're called asylum seekers is they claim asylum, but they are in reality, they are economic migrants. That is the
Well, a good number, not all, right? We would accept
not
that
all,
some,
not all, but many are choosing to come here. Let's remember they're leaving France, which is a safe country.
Yes, I've often said that. I'm no great fan of Emmanuel Macron, but it's difficult to see why fleeing France is not fleeing one safe haven to another.
Exactly. France, there is no reason you're not fleeing persecution if you're leaving France. So people are choosing to come to the UK for a reason. One of the main pull factors is their ability to work illegally, unfortunately. So the black market, and also the welfare provision that they're entitled to. So they will get put up in sometimes quite nice hotels. They will, costing the taxpayers £6 million a day, incidentally. They will have, legally aided lawyers, and they will be able to spend several years in this country in some instances, during which time they might lay down roots and have a baby. And once they've had a baby or got some kind of relationship, then they can start claiming family life rights, and that then becomes very difficult to enable removal. So, that's why the UK is very attractive. But yeah, a lot of people are economic migrants, not all, but they claim asylum because it's an easy way into the UK.
Another couple, which I can take together as a couplet on this sort of theme. Valerie Coker asks, instead of spending billions on sending people to Rwanda, why can't we just employ border patrols with loud hailers telling people in small boats to turn back because they'll not be allowed to land? I mean, even if that wasn't your preferred mechanism, I guess the question there is, what is the balance of spending resources on removals and actually spending resources, further up earlier in terms of prevention rather than removing people once they've made it? And then Sheldon Wilkie asks, do you think new migrants should assimilate or integrate, or assimilate and integrate, I guess he means? And, what more could be done there? There's, I mean, we are a very cosmopolitan, multicultural society, but do you think there's insufficient integration with immigrant communities into the wider British population?
So on the first question, boats being turned back really only works with French consent, because the French government needs to accept people going back into French waters and back onto French ports and French territory. They currently don't accept. And so, without that agreement from France, turning boats around on the channel won't work. I did visit one country which has succeeded in stopping their illegal migration problem, and that's Greece. In 2016, they had 1 million illegal arrivals. Last year, they had under 20,000. I would take that 90% fall any day. And they did it with heavily robust borders. So on the Turkey-Greece land border, they built a wall. And I visited this wall, and it's an incredibly robust wall. It's reinforced, it's militarized. There are armored vehicles, there are soldiers, there are posts. And really, nowadays, no one really crosses that land border. And on their maritime border, they use the Navy. And again, they used real deterrence on the waters. And that's how they had a 90% fall. There's one country other than Australia that's really succeeded in tackling their illegal migration problem. And assimilation and integration. Well, I think yes is the answer. I think that new migrants, if they're choosing to come to this country and if they have the privilege, it's a privilege to be British, that they owe Britain a level of commitment, and as a result, integration and an adherence to British values.
But what's that sort of mean? How do you test that, either the values or culturally? I mean, would you have, I don't know, English language only in government forms? Would they have to, I don't know, perform some civic ceremony of some sort? We can will that end. I'm just trying to work out what the means would be of achieving it.
I think that's a very difficult question. I think that you engender it in schools and in our communities. And I was a co-founder of Michaela Community School. It's in my hometown of Wembley. It's a very ethnically diverse area, and Michaela, and I was chairman of governors for the first few years. and I'm not involved anymore, but Michaela just won a victory in court in relation to a prayer ban that the headmistress imposes, because it's multi-faith. You know, there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Jews, there are Christians, and
she enforces compromises really between the different groups so everybody can get along. I mean, it means that nobody gets everything they want, but it means everybody can kind of assimilate and work together. That's the basic strategy and policy, if I understand it.
Correct. Everybody makes compromise in the name of the common good, and that common good is defined by British values and a unifying vision of Britain and what British history, British culture, and celebrating what it is to be British. And that's a very inspiring vision. It's a unifying vision, but everyone accepts that they can't impose their particular will upon the majority. I think that's a microcosm for how we can engender and cultivate a more cohesive society and embrace difference and people's diversity, but also unify around a common and inspiring theme that keeps our society together.
We're right on the clock. We've had nearly 100 questions. I mean, obviously we can't get through them all, but I'm just going to try and put another 2 or 3 to you. One's on the immigration asylum issue. Jeffrey Mould asks, in a piece in the Telegraph today, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper pledges the Labour government will work with the French and others to smash the people trafficking gangs and thus stop the boats before they launch. Why has the government failed to do this in their 14-year tenure? I guess one way of framing that would be to say, are Labour onto something here, or is it just sort of window dressing and the Conservatives are doing it anyway? Or do they have a point that coordination hasn't been as good? And then you've mentioned the use of the Navy and the rest of it. I'm therefore going to pick 2 questions, not specifically on the asylum or immigration point, but might overlap with them, Suella. Grenville Hargreaves asks, bearing in mind that one of the main responsibilities of a government is to maintain security, how do you feel about the poor state of our military and the lack of realistic spending to address this in dangerous times? And C. Penny asks, why has defence spending not moved to 2.5% of GDP, given the recent geopolitical events in the Red Sea, especially? Chris Penny, I should say that is. I've never worried about those GDP targets, because I think you've got to spend on defence what you need to spend on defence. I mean, if our GDP halves, it's not obvious to me our defence spending should halve. And if our GDP doubles, it's not obvious to me that our defence spending needs to naturally double. I'm a bit sceptical about those targets, as I was on international aid, but I get the aim for looking for an uplift. So there's that question of the Yvette Cooper approach on collaboration with the French, and then finish on those 2 questions on the state of our military resources and defence in Britain, Suella.
The French have flatly refused to do any kind of returns agreement with the United Kingdom. As I said, they need to consent to taking back migrants from the UK. I think, realistically speaking, for the French, they have put in more effort. We've given them a lot more money to do so. They've intercepted a little bit more on the French coastline. For them, their illegal migration priority is not actually on their northern coastline. It's on their southern border with Italy. And their main gripe is with Italy, actually, with migrants coming in from the southeast. So for them, and politically speaking, it is, it's very challenging to get a French president to really use his capital to take back migrants. That, I think, would be a very difficult sell for a French president. Personally, I think there's actually an interest for the French to do it, because Calais and the Pas-de-Calais region is a magnet for migrants. They all go there, they camp out. The Sangatte camp is really still there, really. It's very damaging to the local agriculture, to the local tourist industry, and the regional government there is very hostile to the failure, as it perceives, of the French government to tackle the problem. They're only going to Calais because they want to go to the UK. Now, if they couldn't get to the UK because the French did a kind of returns agreement, they wouldn't go to Calais in the first place. So I think you could fix both of the problems with some kind of deal. Good luck to Labour, but I mean, ultimately, I think it is almost impossible to do something like that. We've really tried every avenue. Secondly, on defence, listen, I think I've just come back from Israel, and what I found very eye-opening, obviously the very tragic circumstances of the Hamas attack, The other angle that I had my eyes open to was the threat posed by Iran. And Iran is the first Shiite state in the Middle East, and it wants to make the rest of the Middle East Shiite and Islamist and extremist. And it's funding Hamas, it's funding Hezbollah in the north, it's funding all these hundreds of Shia militia groups with the aim of taking over the Middle East and also destroying Israel. But it's an autocratic regime. It totally it oppresses women, it oppresses minority groups. There's no freedom of speech, and it's building a nuclear bomb in flagrant contravention of an international agreement. It's an ally of Russia, another autocratic regime which is engaged in a brutal war. And they are allies with China, which we know carries out espionage, hostile attacks, and is a malign influence in the world. I think the trio of those hostile states is a really serious risk and threat to democracy and the West. And I think the real divergence for global geopolitics going forward, or right now going forward, is between autocracy, oppression, and dictatorship, and hostility from these states, and Western democratic values. And I think we're engaged in this battle. I'm not quite sure who's going to win, actually, right now. When you look at the level of militarization, the funding, and the power that these autocratic hostile states are acquiring.
So you think we are underfunding our side of the battle, do you?
So that leads me to say there's an imperative, there's an essential imperative for the UK to increase its defence spending, because I think we are exposed, and I don't think we can take for granted that peace in the West can continue with the rise, the ascendancy of these hostile states.
Suella, thank you so much for joining us. We've overrun our time a bit. I promised to let you get away by 7, but I haven't missed my target by any more than the government has missed its budget deficit reduction target over the last 14 years. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. It's been brilliant to have you with us. Thank you. We've had hundreds of people joining us throughout the course of this first Pop Conversation. So thanks to all of you who joined us. We had nearly 100 questions put in, so we could have stayed here until the House of Commons had stopped voting at 4 o'clock in the morning, but we'll let Suella get on with her evening. We have put in the chat links for our next Pop Conversation with David Starkey on the 1st of May and with Liz Truss on the 7th of May. We also have Robert Jenrick coming up on May the 13th. So do click on to those. If you're not already registered, please do register. I promise next time not to like the sound of my own voice quite so much and to try and get to more of your questions. But for kicking off our series of Pop Conversations, Suella, thanks. You're a terrific first guest. Always brilliant to hear from you. Thank you so much, and keep fighting the good fight. You'll have PopCon's full support. It's been brilliant to spend the last hour with you. Thanks so much.